Hello, my friends. Lori Ashcraft here, your host for another episode of Viva La Evolution, which is produced by Recovery and Resilience Solution, a training and consulting branch of Crestwood Behavioral Health. And we picked up some new sponsors, got their little logos down there. And if any of you want to be a sponsor, we'd be delighted to have you. There's no money involved. It's absolutely free. All you do is you help us disseminate the material. So let us know about that. And we'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. See that little subscription thing that pops up? That would help us a lot. And if you push the little bell next to subscribe, that will let you know when we have a new podcast up. So, got all good ideas. Now today, I have an amazing treat for you. It's amazing that I was able to get these people together. That's part of the amazement. And the other part is that they're amazing people. And the other part is that they did an amazing thing. So let me get the book back over here. So I'm talking about this book that is a fundraising book for NAPS, National Association of Peer Support. There's the editors down there, Rita, Jonathan, Gita, and Joanne. They'll tell you about this, so I don't want to go into much detail. But they put this book together as an amazing resource for supporting a peer workforce. You will love it. And today, you get to hear the backstory about how and why this book got put together. And you know how this is? Have you ever like read a book and you thought it was interesting, but then you got to meet the author? And after you met the author, you go back and read the book again and you go, whoa, now I get the heart of the book. I get the guts of the book. Now I see why they said this or why they did that. So that's the joy of meeting the people that put this book together. And as I mentioned, they're all amazing people. You probably already know them. But if you don't, you're going to get to know some people that are in our corner doing some amazing stuff. So without me babbling on any further, I'm going to turn them on and get started. Here we go. So here we are with Joanne Forbes, Gita Enders, Jonathan Edwards, and Rita Kronheis, the editors of this amazing book that they edited. They're going to tell you all about it, how it came about, and so forth. And I know I won't get a word in yet edgewise after we start, so I just want to say a couple things. One is I'm so happy that the foreword was done by Celia Brown and Larry Davidson, two of our colleagues that have been wonderful pioneers in helping us in the peer movement. So thank you guys for doing that. That was just a wonderful call. And we'll get into this, but I just have to say, look how fat this book is. I mean, this is not a 50-page pamphlet. They put so much work into this. It's got charts and graphs and references, everything you'd ever really want to know about peer supervision. So I can't say enough about the work they did with this. And if you don't have this, you got to go get it, because it's one of those reference books that you'll go back to again and again when you're trying to figure out peer supervision. So, okay. Now, from now on, I'm just going to ask a question now and then, and these guys are going to do the talking. So I'm thinking a good place to start is a little bit about Steve Harrington. And we have a video of Steve that I recorded, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago or something. Do you know how long ago that was, Rita?
Gosh, no, I don't know.
6 to 8 years ago, probably 8 years ago. And we were at a conference, and I said, Steve, can I just do a quick little video of you talking about your experience. And of course, Steve always says yes.
Steve, you had a whole life before this. You've written books on nature. You've been an attorney. Tell me about that life a little bit and how you got here.
I was diagnosed with schizophrenia and major depression in my early 40s, which is really late.
Yeah.
But the more I thought about it, the more I recognized that I was actually having symptoms, I recall, like 18, 20. But I thought, as odd as this may seem, I thought everybody heard voices.
I know. Yes.
And I thought everybody had visual hallucinations, so what I would call my ghosts. And then I reached a point where there was a loss of a good family friend, a close family friend, and that really left me depressed.
Yeah.
And when I got depressed, it was a very serious depression, and it robbed me of my coping skills that I didn't realize I really had for schizophrenia. And so then I ended up in a psychiatric unit where I was trying to figure these things out, and they gave me these labels. And it was really an interesting experience, I think, for them as well as for me, for the clinicians as well as
because you were
myself.
an odd representation of what they're. You didn't fall into one of their boxes, basically.
Yeah, basically they were successful in jamming me into one. But I was sharing a room with another patient, and I was there for 3 days and wasn't feeling any better. I was taking the medications and kept waiting to feel better. And finally, I just decided, if I'm going to feel better, I'm going to have to take responsibility to do it myself. And so I had done a lot of strategic planning for major corporations, and so I thought, well, maybe I could do that for my own life. And at that point, I hadn't heard of RAP. I didn't even know what RAP was, but it was really RAP.
The Wellness Recovery Action Plan.
Exactly. So I went down to the hallway and the nurse's station, and I asked for the big sheets of newsprint that they use for flip charts, and the markers and the tape. They willingly gave me those 3 things, and that's all you need for strategic planning, right? So I went back to my room, and I'm designing my mission statement, my vision, my value statements, my goals, my objectives. And it's like some of my goals were like I wanted to own my own house again. I wanted to get a car back because I because of the illness had some financial issues, and I lost my car. I wanted to get a job back again. I wanted to get another degree, wanted to write another book, all these kinds of things. And so anyway, my roommate got a little upset, a little perturbed because he couldn't lay down because I've got these sheets of paper with these goals and objectives all over. So my doctor was going down the hallway and called my doctor in. And the doctor stood at the doorway and he just gazed all around, didn't say a word. And he went to the nurse's desk, and a few minutes later I had these 2 big technicians
I'm just thinking
come. And they escorted me to a little room, took all my clothes, to this white room that was padded.
Tied you up.
And no, I wasn't restrained, but I was locked in.
Secluded.
Yes, and it took me about 2 days to get the attention of a nurse, and I said, why am I here? Because they're feeding me through, it was like being in jail, because they had like this little slot that they fed you from, and where they gave you your medications and such. And so I asked the nurse, why am I here? And she said, well, we saw your papers. And I said, well, I was just feeling better. I mean, when I was doing that, I wasn't depressed. I was filled with hope. I was gung-ho. And now I'm in here. And she said, well, we saw what you wrote on the papers. I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, do you really believe you could do all those things? And I said, yes. And she said, you're delusional.
Isn't that something?
She said, if you believe that, we don't know what you'll do. You're a risk.
Oh, my.
And then a couple of days after that, I met with my psychiatrist. And he sat me down. He said, Steve, we're going to sit down and have a talk. And we did. It was mostly him talking.
Yes.
He told me basically my life was over. He said that I had schizophrenia and that I would be dealing with large amounts of medication the rest of my life. I'd be in a psychiatric unit at least 2 or 3 times a year. He said, you'll never get another job. You'll never get another degree. You'll never get a house back. You'll never get a car back. You'll probably live in a group home. You'll never write a single book again. He said, you just won't live a normal life. He said, get used to it. You have a mental illness. And I got hooked up with some classes that were taught by peers and were for peers, and met people who were, like me.
Yeah.
But had hope.
Yeah.
And their hope was contagious.
Yes.
And it was like an awakening.
It's like, if they can do it, I can do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was, they just fueled me with hope that I had thought had gone completely out and was going to be extinguished for the rest of my life. So now looking back, I proved that psychiatrist wrong on everything except 2 things. He said I'd never write a single book again, and he's right. I've written 4. And then
I love it.
And then he said I'd never live a normal life, and thank God, because I'm living an extraordinary life. The experience is really what has taught me about what's important in life and how to lead a satisfying and happy life.
Yes.
It's been that.
Yes.
It's like, I've got all kinds of book learning.
Yes.
But you don't learn about life in a classroom like that. That it's through these challenges that rob you of your hope and drive you you think into the ground so far you can't see up. But
Right. Yeah.
And things change, and you learn so much from them. And for me, when I think about recovery, it is a journey, and I hope that journey never ends for me. I don't ever describe myself as recovered, because that kind of gives it a finality that I don't want.
Yes.
Because
you want to keep learning and growing.
Exactly. I want to keep growing. I want to keep learning. So I hope I never recover, but I hope my recovery journey continues forever.
So you saw a little clip of that. And now let's get into some more narrative about Steve. So who wants to pick this up and talk a little bit about the amazing work that Steve did to inspire us and get us started on this peer track?
I can pick that up because Steve was a dear friend. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with Steve for many, many years. And he was a mentor and a cherished friend. And I just want to go back to sort of the beginnings of NAPS, the National Association of Peer Supporters. Steve and a group in Grand Rapids, Michigan came together. They were all peer specialists, and they all recognized that they were struggling with some areas of being peer supporters, and realized that that was probably happening all around the country. So Steve took the initiative of doing outreach and visiting places and trying to track down people that were doing peer support all around the country.
He came and saw us in Phoenix.
Yeah, yeah. And he started a newsletter. So he and his little merry band of peer specialists were putting out, they were hand printing these newsletters and hand stamping them and having parties of putting the newsletters together once a month. And he just wrote articles about what was happening in peer support. He went around and did surveys of the peer supporters that he could find so that he had some idea of what was happening in the peer workforce. And before long, SAMHSA came knocking on the door and said, we don't know anybody who knows as much about peer support as you do, Steve. So he gave them information. He became part of this Recovery to Practice SAMHSA initiative that was really trying to infuse recovery through the clinical practices. And that's where I got to know him, because I am and was an instructional designer. So I helped him with the curriculum for that. As a part of the curriculum, there was a big, at one point in 2012, at one of the national conferences, they had this big thing about, we want to have national guidelines, and so we took on the initiative of pulling together all of the information we could find about guidelines and what resonated with us and what didn't resonate with us. And eventually that became the national practice guidelines. And I should say that Steve not only did a newsletter, but he also did an annual conference every year. And it was the only national conference for many years, annual national conference that traveled around the country. He chose a different city and brought peer specialists in from around the country. And it went on beyond him. This year, they just celebrated the 16th annual, so it's been going on for quite a while. And so that's a little bit about the National Association of Peer Supporters. And I mentioned the National Practice Guidelines because in 2013, the association issued these practice guidelines, and they were well received in the field. And at the same time, the National Association was getting a lot of feedback that supervisors really didn't understand what peer specialists did.
Yeah.
And a lot of that came out of a decision that the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services did in 2007. They wanted to infuse peer support. They named it an evidence-based practice, but they didn't have an easy way of supervising it within clinical settings because there just weren't enough peer specialists with experience at that time to be good supervisors. And yet, that changed the flavor of peer support. And my colleague Joanne is going to talk quite a bit about that. So that's just a little bit of the background. What happened in 2018 is that a couple of us, including Dr. Edwards, came together and we recognized that supervision was not really well informed about what the values, the core values and practices of peer support were. So given his and Gita's experience in supervising peer specialists from the perspective of having lived experience themselves, they added a new column to the practice guidelines that said the role of the supervisor is, and then linked it to every one of the practice guidelines to create a new version of the practice guidelines. We renamed it the National Practice Guidelines for Peer Specialists and Supervisors. And so during that process, we became a little bit of a work group. There were a number of people that came together, including Jonathan, including Gita, and Joanne joined us during that time frame as well. And the four of us have been having very rich conversations, doing amazing projects together, doing presentations, doing a lot of different things as a work group. And one day we were like in between projects and we said, what are we going to do next? And I said, let's do a book. Let's do a book. And they're all looking at me like, are you crazy?
That's just like you, Rita.
I said, well, the idea that I have is we've had all of these national conferences. We've had all of these amazing presenters. Often I go to a national conference and they're all up against each other and I can only go to one. And I want to find out what all the others did. And so we all collectively, I think, had this idea of reaching out to the presenters who had been doing the national conference presentations to just write a short article about what their presentation was about and then to compile that. So that was sort of the genesis of the book.
I remember when you guys took that on, I thought, this is going to be really hard. And these are really busy people. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but it did. It did because you're exceptional people. That's why it worked. Yeah. And, speaking of exceptions, I just want to say on your behalf, Rita, at one of the conferences, just before the conference, Steve had a very debilitating stroke. And Steve was the kind of leader that didn't write a lot of stuff down. It was all in his head. He knew exactly what he was doing. And you just had to ask him and he'd tell you. But we couldn't ask him. So Rita stepped in and pulled that conference together and made it work. And the rest of us just said, what should we do? And she told us. And it was, and it worked. By some miracle, it worked. So Rita, thank you for making that happen and being the person that you are to do that. And then not long after that, she recruited me to be a co-director. So we co-directed NAPS for, I don't know, a couple of years or something.
Now, wait a minute. I have to tell the story because at that point,
Okay.
I was not an executive director by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure.
And I knew I was way beyond my comfort zone and element. And I knew that you had been running businesses for quite a long time and had all of the skills that we were lacking. And so I went to Lori and I said, Lori, would you direct NAFs? And she looked at me and she said, no. She said, but I will co-direct it with you. And I was like, oh my God, Lori wants to co-direct. She's gonna co. It was just like one of these heart attack moments for me because I was just starstruck anytime I saw Lori,
Oh,
anytime I had a chance to talk to Lori. And it was all the courage I could summon to even ask her if she would consider directing. And then when she said no, and I'm like, oh, and then she said, but I'll co-direct. And I'm like, oh my God.
well, I just knew if you were going to be involved, I could do my part and we could be a good team. So, yeah, just a little history there. We can keep weaving a little history in now and then because that might be kind of fun. So, before I interrupted you, you were about to hand something off to Joanne, I think.
Sure. Yep. We're talking about supervision, right?
Yeah.
Well, part of the way Rita and I got connected is I had decided to do my dissertation on peer supervision. And part of the impetus was that 2007 letter of guidance from CMS that suggested that peers be supervised by mental health professionals as defined by each state. And that just did not sit very well with me at all. And I decided that I was going to figure out the implications of that guidance. So I started that process, and a mutual colleague of ours at one point said, you know, you really need to talk to Rita Kronice. And so Rita and I started meeting Monday mornings. We called it Code and Coffee because I was doing a qualitative study of the experiences of peer support workers supervised by non-peers. And so that's kind of how I joined this illustrious group. And yeah, that's kind of how that started. At a later point, I can talk more about that research. But the other thing I wanted to say is kind of underlying everything that we do is that old mantra that's been around from the 80s, which says nothing about us without us. And I think all of us have gone for advanced degrees. We recognize literature importance and research. And what we were seeing, frankly, was lots of research about peer supervision, but not much of it by anybody who actually had lived experience or who had done peer supervision or peer support.
Yeah.
So that really allowed us to have, as Rita mentioned, very rich conversations and ultimately rich projects. And Jonathan, I think, you know, some of your work on supervision and the functions, you and Gita, added to that legacy of nothing about us without us. So I'm kind of going to hand it over to you for a little bit to talk about that.
Well, thank you, Joanne and Rita and Lori and Gita. And I guess this is a nice timeline because Joanne, you talked about getting together with Rita and calling it Coffee and Coding or Coding and Coffee. And I don't know how long the two of you had been meeting, but I remember when you first started working on your dissertation and we were trying to connect. And I remember when we finally caught up, I was having a conversation with you. I was in the back seat of a livery cab and you said, you really are busy. I appreciate this. And it just took a while for us to gel because we were both so incredibly busy. But you know, before long, it was a couple of years later, and I was finishing up my dissertation, and Rita was gracious enough to invite me to join the two of you on Monday mornings. And I remember showing you my dissertation slides and coming to your defense, your dissertation defense, and feeling inspired, like, oh, I can do this, you know, just like looking at your slides and your smart art and your tables and, you know, just how you laid out everything. And you defended 2 months before I did. And I remember you and Rita had advised me, you may not want to keep all that on the slide because they're going to ask you about it. And we don't know that it's as important as these other things you have to say. So you all kind of took me in under your wing. And then, I defended successfully and started working with the two of you. And we did an abundance of projects. I can't even begin to tell you how many webinars, and we did a learning collaborative that was funded. We did a couple of webinars from Magellan. The learning collaborative we gave was, I think, 6 months, and we sort of put that together from scratch, and it was organized. And a group had actually emerged out of that continues to meet, a small cohort from that learning collaborative. And we got to a certain place. There were many others who, or a few others who worked with us. I remember, Martha was with us for a while. Ivana Bond was with us. Dana contributed. There were a few others, and Jessica Wolf. And I know that we were all involved one summer trying to finish up those supervision practice guidelines that Dana talked about at one of the subsequent NAPS conferences. So there's just been this long, long history. And then we found ourselves finishing the learning collaborative and saying, what do we do next? And Rita, as you said, maybe we'll do the book. And, it's seemingly
I need to interject something really quickly, and that is that Celia was part of our learning collaborative. She was one of the key presenters for that, and it was just great having her be a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we had some really good partners. We had Amy Detner and Tim Saubers come in for the youth. We had Ian join. So we had a number of presenters that came in and helped us to make this learning collaborative really successful. So here we are back, I guess 2 years ago, when we decided to do the book. And basically that leads right into this small piece that I was going to talk about. What about the book? And, for us, it was a passion project based on gathering experiences from the field of peer support and supervision. And simply, the book is intended to guide the practice of peer support and supervision, and it's based on topics by presenters at 5 consecutive annual national conferences. And I think those years spanned from 2016 to 2021. We did this whole, content review of looking at programs and the titles of workshops and designing a form and doing outreach. And, the more we talk about it, I realize how miraculous it is that, wanting to see your work published, but also the feasibility and the time involved in doing that, that we got so many responses. It truly is a miracle. And, we basically asked people for, 5-page narratives. We gave them a template. And the book, is divided into 5 different sections. And for the listener, these 485 pages are divided into 13 chapters, and the major parts are understanding peer support and behavioral health, peer support values and standards, the practice of peer support, successful supervision, and special interests. There are also appendices that provide biographies of all the contributors, and that in itself is very important peer support history. And then there's a short history of NAPS and tributes to leaders like Steve Harrington that Rita spoke about. So the book is a lot more than a practice guide. It's an historical tome of great value that I think will be around for the many, many years to come. And the last thing that I'll say before I pass off to one of my co-editors, I'm so proud to always say that, is the audience. Just to mention that the target audience for the book naturally is supervisors of peer support workers who seek to improve their practice of supervision through peer-informed approaches that involve collaborative supervision. And Gita and I have presented on many workshops on collaborative supervision, or supervision as collaboration. And not just in mental health, but across the spectrum of workplace settings and recent innovations, the youth, the family, the justice impacted. The book, as we've heard, is also appropriate for state directors of mental health programs, agency administrators, program coordinators, peer support practitioners, because that gives them a sense of their history and also some of the current issues that we're still navigating, and also non-peer coworkers and colleagues, and anyone who's interested in entering or learning more about peer support workforce. So The book is growing in its pride. We each had 10 copies in a box in our homes. And I just was fortunate to take a trip to the Netherlands, and I broke the seal and grabbed 5 of them. And my luggage was overweight, but they let me through, and I gave the books out, and glad to be spreading the good word around the globe.
Yeah.
And thanks to my wonderful colleagues that were able to do that. And so I think at that point, I'll pass it back to, I'm going to just pass it back to Rita as sort of the air traffic controller. I know we have a lot of segments to talk about, but nobody knows the layout and the terrain as good as Rita does.
But before we do that, we haven't given Gita even a moment of airtime. So Gita,
Absolutely.
let's hear from you. How did you get involved with this group of characters?
And you're on mute.
Always. But it's funny you should ask, because as we were talking about this Monday morning standing 9 o'clock meeting that we've been having for years, does anyone remember how I came to this meeting? We were working on one specific thing. I don't know if it was the wasn't the brass tacks collaboration. I'm just going to turn to Rita again and ask if she remember. It's been years now. So,
You've been in and out of the group since the beginning. But I seem to recall when you really started coming often was with the NAPS Supervision Learning Collaborative.
that I
You
was
were
going to,
part of that.
yeah, I was going to actually mention that before when Jonathan was talking about it. Yeah, and I don't think we knew at the beginning how involved we would be with the learning collaborative, but people, you know, as traditional, we would come on and give a presentation, and as we social workers will always do, and presenters break people up into small groups and discuss one facet of the material that we had gone over. And so we did coalesce into a group that would meet, decide the topic, present the topic, receive questions for further exploration. And as Jonathan mentioned, that group, which I can't remember what year we started, but that group is still meeting. Yes, coming back to me. It was early COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't seem to slow you guys down any. You just kept cranking.
As Jonathan puts in the chat, there's virtuality had become the norm at that point. And so there were a lot of requests for online support groups, telehealth, and certainly webinars and conferences. And it's interesting because we've seen this, these learning collaboratives have spread just tangentially. So the State Office of Mental Health in New York has funded a program for peer bridgers in the comprehensive psychiatric emergency programs. And this also met virtually. And there was the, Jonathan, I'm sorry, you just said it yesterday, reframing crisis webinars that we had during the lockdown, which again, Celia was instrumental. Jonathan, I think, not sure which of them or both together created that. It is very difficult to tease the layers apart.
Well, might not be that important. The key here is that in spite of any number of obstacles, you guys managed to put this book together in really a very short period of time, given what it usually takes to put a book together and get it published. So good work on all of your parts.
Well, I'm going to drop in and put an addendum on that. It felt to me like we had actually done this in 1 year. So can anyone verify that it was 1 year?
It was a year. Mhm.
Which looking back, when a project has a lot of moving parts and several people involved, I have developed the habit of giving a 2-year deadline. When can we have this project wrapped up? 2 years. And that's really been, especially post-COVID, where some people are here, some people are at home. It's not easy to meet. People schedule back-to-back meetings. And so it only took a year. And we were very organized. We had our Monday meeting, laid out tasks. People did what needed to be done. And this was in and amongst, Jonathan calls them layers, other research that we were all participating in. But the thing I wanted to mention, I don't want to lose sight of, is so when we first had the book ready for publication, we were shopping it to standard educational, scholarly publishers. And what happened was a noted academic publisher had offered to accept the book with some revisions and certain abrogations of rights. For example, they wanted the rights to the contributions in perpetuity. And we had not only not made that arrangement with the contributors, but didn't really have the intention of doing so. And the other issue at hand was they wanted to set a price point for the book at something in the neighborhood of $75.
Yeah.
And we said, this is not our audience.
Mhm.
Because unfortunately, in most of the country, peer support workers are grossly underpaid. I might even say in all of the country, peer support workers are grossly underpaid.
Mhm.
And we wanted them to have access to this book because the big overarching goal is to get peer support workers into supervisory positions, which again, Joanne will go back to in her research, and even further on into management, and if they choose, into non-peer roles. So I think, as you were saying, Lori, the book is accessible to everyone from peer support workers to senior leadership in
Yeah.
an organization.
And what's it selling for now, Gita? I'm
I
looking, but I
believe
don't.
it is $26 for the paperback copy.
Yeah.
I think $12.99 as a Kindle book. And if you're lucky enough to be at a National Association of Peer Supporters conference, we do offer a discounted special of $20 even. And we sold quite a number of them at this year's
Oh, good.
conference.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
just,
one other thing to add to that is, we all decided that this was a passion project. It was a give back project, and every bit of the proceeds go back to NAPS. So we're not taking any funds for this. Anything, above and beyond the publishing fees goes right back to the organization.
wonderful, wonderful. And having been intimately involved with NAPS for a number of years, money has always been an issue. So it's wonderful to have a source of income available.
Well, we had broken $6,000 in revenue for just the book at this last conference.
Oh,
So
good.
that's a start.
Yeah, it's a good start.
I feel like such a wannabe philanthropist being able to go to a different country and say, I'm not taking any of the proceeds. It's for a wonderful organization that supports the preservation and growth of peer support. So it is a little bit sexy to love to do something where you don't look for, in fact, we're still trying to figure out how to pay for the 10 author copies that we were sent. So I wouldn't say that that's self-effacement, but it's probably more like a sense of pride and unconditional love for the field that we're in.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, yeah.
And
And
you know,
I just wanted to pop, excuse me just a second, I wanted to pop this in because y'all were talking about your degrees and your accomplishments and so forth, and how that's helped make this possible. But you know, the real guts of it comes from all of our personal experiences of, you know, receiving services. Some of us then went on to be peer support workers and then on from there. And I think that firsthand experience is really what qualifies all of you to to edit it, because you feel what works, you feel what's right because you've been there. Sorry, Joanne, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, that's a perfect segue, Lori, because to Gita's point, when we were talking with the academic publishers, what we realized early on is that they were going to kind of reframe our intent.
Mhm.
And so when we made the decision to self-publish, we hadn't come up with a title. But we somehow, in one of our meetings, you know, decided that we wanted something that spoke to everyone. And
Yeah.
so that's why we used What It Takes.
Yeah, that's a great
Because
title.
people who are doing this work, you know, that resonates because, you know, as we all know, when you first go down that road, you don't know anything, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So we really were reaching out to a specific audience
Mhm.
of peers across the country, and
Yeah.
now it turns out across the world. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
someone from Japan reached out as well, and Jonathan is spreading good news across other countries as well. But that's what we wanted. We really wanted that audience. And as Gita had kind of intimated, the number one finding of my research, you know, this is the mic drop, everybody is going to be shocked, is that peers want to be supervised by more experienced peers.
Of course. Of course.
And it was unanimous across this country. I spoke to people in various areas of the country in various positions, and there was not one soul who said differently.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I was talking to peers who were supervised by non-peers, and obviously the people I was able to reach, they were still in their positions. So the non-peer supervisors were positively looked upon, which was, except for a few exceptions.
Yeah.
And one of the other pieces of this is when the non-peer supervisors didn't have the faith and ability to step back and let go, those peers were ready to leave the field.
Yeah.
They talked about micromanaged, that this felt like therapy sessions, that
Mhm.
they were sick and tired of someone doing a mental status on them every time they walked in the door. So it was a very poignant and
Yeah.
very powerful expression by peers across the country
Yeah.
of what they wanted. So the impetus of the book was really to say, we're gathering together the wisdom of all of us in this arena, and we want you to have it, and we want you to use it
Mhm.
to advocate for this very thing, that peers with experience have the ability and the wisdom to supervise other peers.
Yes. Yeah. And you know, Gita and I were in Arizona, way back. And Gita, I think I met you because you came to our peer support training. Is that right?
That is correct. It may
Hmm.
have been in 2003.
Okay,
I'm not showing
2003.
our age. You can feel
No,
free
no,
to.
no. And so we kind of grew along together there. She was in one part of Arizona and I was in another part. And we were both, I was facing this, so I know you must have been facing it, Gita. This whole thing about, you train peers to be peers, and then someone supervises them who is doing their best, but just because of their lack of exposure and experience, falling back on old clinical supervision processes. And let's face it, nobody gets supervised very well in mental health anymore anyway. So it's too bad. But so before you were writing this, Joanne, or collecting your survey information, probably a lot of us were having this experience. I know we were having it in Arizona between Gita and me, for sure. Yeah. So, and not to interrupt us too long, but I'd love to put references to your dissertations in the blog so people can look those up if they want further information. So you may have already sent that to me, but if you haven't, then remind me to ask for it so we can give people that information too. Yeah. So
I have
Rita,
to put in a quick plug for Joanne in terms of talking about supervision by non-peer supervisors. And even though we all know it's a long-standing issue, that it's never been made more plain than when Joanne says, does the electrician supervise the plumber?
yeah.
So earlier when, you were saying, peers being supervised, and I wanted to interject and say electricians, bricklayers, and it really does drive it home.
Yeah.
Joanne has a real gift for simplicity and bringing it home. And so I
Yeah.
appreciate doing our recent workshop, Know Nothing None, with Joanne. And Joanne actually is responsible for the title of the book.
Hmm.
As
Well, Jonathan, I think this is probably a nice place to talk a little bit about that, because it also, is foundational to peer supervision. So I did training with Ike Powell nationally for
Yeah.
years and years and years. And he always had the wisdom to start every training by asking a couple of questions. The first question was always, how many of you volunteered to be a supervisor?
Hmm.
No one ever raised their hand. So that was the no. And then he would say, and when you became a supervisor, what was taken off your plate so that you had time for
Nothing.
supervision? Nothing.
Mhm.
And then Jonathan very wisely said, and the other question that needs to be asked is, what training have you had?
Mhm.
None.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing I just want to underscore about the importance of this book is that when you look at the literature regarding peer support, the initial literature was very robust and primarily about the barriers and the challenges of integrating peers onto already established multi-professional teams. And every single piece of literature ended with the same solution: supervision. Now, they didn't talk about
Mhm.
anything beyond that. Like, what do you mean? Who, what, when, where? And so the mythology about supervision seemed to be growing. My experience as a clinician for many, many, many years was that supervision was a myth.
Hmm.
For clinicians and for most
Yeah.
professions like electricians and plumbers, right? You learn from someone who's done the job.
Mhm.
So this 2007 recommendation to have people who have never given peer support, don't have lived experience, don't understand it, are overwhelmed, incredibly busy. The thought that that was going to work was just
Yeah.
quite surprising, to
Yes.
say the least.
Yeah.
So that whole notion of giving peers a reference book
Yes. Yeah.
that they could use you know, and thumb through it and find whatever article,
And
whatever.
they could say, you know, you're not supervising me right. It says so right here in the book.
Right.
Rita, let's get
Wow.
back to you since you're the switchboard operator here.
About that. I did want to make sure that we give a shout out to a couple of people that were instrumental in the success of the book. One is Kelsey Stang, who pulled all of it together. She was very much about, she was named as, you know, somebody who's a major contributor. She really did a lot of the organization behind the scenes. She had a lot of knowledge about how to self-publish. There were a lot of pieces that none of the four of us really had that she just really brought together, as well as Dana Fogelsong. She came in and she cleared the way to make sure that we were good to go through NAPS to be able to put the book through. But I
Mhm.
also want to give a big shout out to you, Lori, because you not only wrote like a whole chapter, but you also framed the whole, there's a whole chapter on what we probably shouldn't have called fallen leaders, now that there's a different connotation for that, but the leaders that have passed on, the
Oh,
cherished leaders that we lost, like Steve Harrington,
yeah.
like Bill Anthony, and you had just pulled together the most amazing tribute to Bill Anthony, who had just passed very recently at the point in time that we put together the book, and just some of the most amazing things there, as well as you and Patty had written chapters of your own. But
Yeah.
you were a major contributor to the book as well, and I don't want to lose sight of that, because there
Well,
were
thank
other,
you. Thank you for
yeah.
that, Rita. I didn't feel like I did very much, but thank you. Yeah.
I think none of us feel like we did that much, but together, look at what we accomplished, because
Yeah.
we each did
Yeah.
small parts. The thing that I remember most of all was Joanne framing the book. You know, she did the architecture for how the book was going to be laid out. She pulled together all of the contributions as they were coming in. She
Hmm.
organized them and she did all of that. And at the same time, we were saying, well, how are we going to connect these pieces together? So Gita was like writing all of the notations from the editors, and Jonathan was bringing the research that he had done, and really making sure that we had a lot of solid supervision. I mean, so we all had pieces, and
Yeah.
it's interesting how this puzzle of a book, we each had a piece to bring, but not a lot of overlap in the pieces, so we weren't duplicating effort. We each had a piece that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
important to the whole. So
Great. Well, are there anything you wish you would have done differently with the book, like drawbacks or anything? What comes
Can
to
I?
mind?
Yeah, just I think Rita and I have a lot to say about this because we were fortunate enough to be guests on the Unapologetically Black Unicorns, Karis Merrick's podcast series, and we talked a lot about not just the book. The book really reflects, and I know Rita can speak to this much better, but I'm just really eager and she'll clean up whatever I mess up. But I'll just say that, Rita was very transparent about talking about how NAPS, despite the valiant efforts of Steve, and I met Steve only on 2 occasions, but I remember the year that I first came to the NAPS conference when it was INAPS. There
I
was a
know.
great effort to bring people of color to that conference. And without even knowing Steve, I just know that he was so hands-on with that. And, despite those efforts, the world of peer support just so reflects, I mean, it really approximates society on so many levels in that it invisibilizes people of color and, other groups that are historically marginalized. And when we talk about wish we had done something better, I started to say, well, maybe try to reach out to a more diverse contributor base. But that becomes very daunting when the book really reflects the dominant voices in peer support, and peer support, like any other milieu or any other profession, sometimes we can get it a little twisted, like, oh, it's peer support, so we're all conscientious around issues of equity and privilege and subjugation. But it's another community where there are roles and there is stratification. And so we've talked a lot about how do we, and I pointed this out at the end of my research, my dissertation research, is to say that, future research really needs to be focused on identifying groups that have limited access, or that are, when I say difficult to reach, because they're not in that mainstream, where they have the privilege of being heard and privilege of being integrated, and that we know that there's probably lots of peer supporters that may not have the same access to technology to even take surveys, to be represented. So how do we bring in more diverse voices? And I know, as a person of color, a Black man, that I recognize my privilege to have the access that I do, because it's not the norm. It's not, and I never want to represent as though I'm the norm, and I never want to portray a sense of color blindness, like color doesn't matter, I'm just another peer. It's not true. We all have intersectional identities, and there are other layers that are important that oftentimes get invisibilized in the face of dominant culture. And as women, I think that you all understand that as well, that you wouldn't be where you were unless you were drawing on other strengths, because it's the heteronormative model. It's a man's world, and particularly a white man's world. So,
Jonathan, I have an idea for you guys' next book. We did a lot of work in Pennsylvania prisons. I think we taught peer support in every one of their prisons. And it was the most moving work I've done, and I've done a lot of it. And that's where you can really pick up minority voices. So I don't know how many peers we trained, but a lot of them. And then they went back to work in the prisons. So if you were to cover that, you'd be getting a forensic voice, and you'd be getting some multiracial voices there. And another place you could pick up on is the huge work going on in the VA. They've really jumped into the peer support workforce idea and put a lot of funding behind it, a lot of effort behind it. So for your next book, you guys, I would suggest you look at those two areas. There's a lot going on there, and a lot we can learn from them. And if you guys could put something together, same kind of stuff, but more focused on what they're facing, that would be wonderful. So there you go. There's your commission.
it would be unprecedented, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's done it. Yeah.
We may even be able to get some funding for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might.
Yeah.
It's a
But we
novel
really
idea.
need to do that as independent and not tie it to an organization, which makes it more challenging. But I think we would need the autonomy to design and also maybe do a participatory action approach where
Well, you can figure that out. There's no one better to figure that out right now than you guys. So, and you can bring other folks in that I'd be happy to help you if you need me to. But and I know I can connect you with some people in Pennsylvania. So there you go. That's your project. Here we are starting a new year. By this time next year, you'll have another book out there.
Our plates are so empty.
Yes. Nothing else to do.
I always think about our copious free time. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But
We know
you
what they
know,
said. If you want
this-
something to get done, ask a busy person.
That's true. But
Yeah.
this area is so important.
Mm.
I think state hospitals, and that's where I spent most of my career. I watched over decades of work as initially the population on inpatient were women. Bunch of depressed women. That shifted over time to men, white men. And when I finally retired from that career, those beds were filled absolutely 100% with people of color and minorities and marginalized people.
Was that because
Many coming out of prisons where their sentences had been finished, but they got transferred to a state hospital for all kinds of reasons, which would take another podcast.
Yeah.
But,
Well, we wouldn't have to do that. So, this
I-
leads us right to, what are the next steps for this workforce? What do you folks see coming
I
down?
wanted to just jump in on the last topic for one last
Okay.
thing to look it up.
Oh,
So-
right, because you go to prison every month, Rita.
Well, not about prison. I'm just looping back to the idea that the book has few voices of color because it was representative of the population of people in NAPS and in the peer support workforce as a whole. One of the things that's in the book is a study that we had done. We had done a survey of the peer support population through NAPS, and Sally Rogers at BU helped me to frame this and author it. And I just wanted to look up the actual percentage. Now, this survey was done in 2014, 2015.
Mhm.
The population of NAPS members, or at least that was reached by the NAPS members, 75% white,
Hmm.
10% color, 9% Latino. So it's like, fewer and fewer people of color, compared to the larger white population. So that was the peer workforce then. Studies that I've seen since then, the demographics are not different. They are still that much, represented by white people, even though the marginalized communities are exactly the opposite. You flip the opposite to, 75 to 80% people of color in the marginalized communities. So are we really reaching the communities we need to reach as a workforce?
Well, that's
And how are we recruiting our workforce? So that's a really big question. And when you talk about how many people in prison, yes, I've been on the inside. It's tragic that there are so many people of color that are, and that's what Celia's whole surviving race was about.
Yeah. And Rita, my study 6 years later found very similar demographic populations. You and Joanne pointed that out. I think it was it was 73% white women in my study of almost 700 people. And the studies do show similar trends in demographic breakdowns. So,
So I think in answer to the question, what's the next step for the workforce? You folks are saying, we need to reach different populations. And let me give you one more. I went to Peerpocalypse. That's an amazing conference if you've never been to that one. There were 800 people. This was 2 years ago. 800 people there. And I met so many peers that were, I don't even know the word here, so forgive me if I'm not saying this right, but that had gender situations, all different. I didn't even know there were that many situations that were out there. And they were doing peer support work, but that, I just see that as a growing population that needs peer support. So I would say add that to your list of people to recruit to do peer support.
Yeah.
So now you've got the veterans, you've got the people who have had a forensic experience, and gender situations. That's if you hit those three populations, that's going to be an amazing contribution to build on what you've got here.
I'm glad we're recording. You've given us our 10-year plan. We're stuck with each other for at least another 10 years.
This is your 1-year plan, Jonathan. You've already showed me that.
As they say, you got papers on me. Huh?
Okay, so we kind of have an idea of what's next, I'd say. Did you miss anything that you wish you'd included?
I'm going to come back to a plug for NAPS, that the book, the proceeds go to NAPS. Within the book, there's a history of NAPS. So if you don't know about NAPS, there's a nice, it actually was based on something that you wrote, Lori, for the 10th anniversary conference. You and Andy kind of went back and wrote this really nice piece that really spoke to pretty much the whole history of the organization. But I just really want to encourage people to think about joining if you're not a member of NAPS, and want to become a member and be connected with a group of people that are doing like work. That's, it's worthwhile.
It's so important to be part of a community. And you don't have to just have one community, you can have a bunch of them, but if you're a peer support specialist, having a community, getting a newsletter, being part of something beyond just what you're dealing with in your own local situation can be so important, so helpful. So, yeah. Well, I just want to thank you all so very much. It was worth all the trouble it took me to get you together. Well, there you have it, my dears. 4 amazing people who took on a difficult task, committed to it during a challenging time, by the way, because most of this was done during COVID. But they managed to meet together, pull together all these stories from a wide range of authors and collect them in a book, publish it, and make it available at a very reasonable price. I think it's $20 for the whole book, and it's almost 500 pages, so it's an amazing resource. Okay, so thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending time with these amazing editors and authors, and yeah, just thanks a lot. I love having you here with us. So have a good week, and we'll be back soon. Take care.